Okay, so I'm curious about your practicing. What are you practicing these days?
Right. What I spend most of my time on is practicing tonality, practicing in various tonalities. I think this is the hardest thing to master in music. What this means is, um, if, um, how can we say? I don't want to get too far out there, but so what basically this means is choosing a scale and trying to be good at playing any possible pattern I can think of in that scale. Um, right. Maybe I should leave it at
No, 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 go
that.
further. This is a podcast. We want to dive deep. What does that mean? Because that sounds just like boring scale work. Is that what that is?
Right. A lot of it is. Um, so one of the most interesting things about music is this idea of tonality. Tonality is a very, very weird thing, and I don't think we really realize as musicians or as people who are musicologists or even people who study psychology of music and music cognition really quite understand how weird tonality is. What I mean by tonality is that we are all constantly scanning our audio world. And what we're looking for all the time, this is completely unconscious. We can't help it. There's only a very small percentage of people who can't do this and who don't do it. It's like way less than 1% of people who have what's called amusia. They don't have the ability to do this, but everybody else does. We're trying to find notes, like what we would call musical notes. And if we find those, we instantly put them in this hierarchy. We find this one note that acts as the tonal center, and then the notes around it have this very, very particular kind of emotional resonances to us. They have physical resonances as well, but those notes have certain meanings to us. And that's what tonality is. And as far as we can tell, no other species does that. When we think of all the amazing musical species in the world, birds and whales and all kinds of animals that do amazing songs, they don't seem to have any preference for this kind of tonal hierarchy that we have. And we all do it in exactly the same way. That's what's really weird. Is all, as far as we can tell, throughout history, in every culture, we all organize music in the same way. We hear it with this tonal center, and then this set of notes around it, basically 12 notes that can react around that. That's just the way we're built. Nobody seems to know exactly why we do that. There's some interesting theories, but this is a fascinating thing. And so understanding these tonalities and how they work within us, how they move within our bodies and within our psychology is a really fascinating thing. And so this is what I really enjoy doing. It's also very hard to master. It's not really that hard to understand. You can understand everything about tonalities by studying for, I don't know, a year or two. But then to master it is really, really difficult. I'm not sure anybody's ever really done it. Maybe, but this is what I enjoy spending time on. It's also what I kind of need to spend time on because if somebody hires me to play on their music, I want to be able. Most of the music that I end up playing on is tonal, and if it isn't, then I'm still applying the same process because there's certain things you have to do to keep music from being tonal, and so I have to be able to play certain notes in certain ways at certain times, and so that ends up being the kind of biggest challenge in music. There are other things too. I should mention rhythm. I do spend awful lot of time on rhythm, which ends up being uh, quite challenging as well. But that's the bulk of it is kind of working with these tonalities and then putting them in rhythms and trying to get be able to play the notes, the right sound, the right time, the right place, the right expression. That's the challenge. Does that make sense?
I think so. I think I've understand it. So as far as like a
Mm.
practical practice session, what does that look like? Because I mean, you obviously got this great big philosophical understudy of what tonality is, but like, when you pick up a bass or you're at a piano, what does that look like?
Right. So for me, the first thing is what we would call warming up. Um, I, uh, I'd like a better term than that, but that's what we use. The first thing I do is stretching, and I can't play unless I've done this. I don't recommend to any of my students. I don't recommend that they play without warming up too. So it's doing some stretching. If I have an hour to play, this would maybe 5 minutes. Um, and then I pick up the bass and do some very, very simple, focused things. And this is not thinking about tonality. This is thinking about the body mechanics and how that relates to the structure of the instrument. So this is just playing one note with my first finger and trying to play it well, good tone in the right moment I want it to be played with the right dynamic and all that. This is another 10 minutes or so I spend doing these very focused exercises, running through all the permutations of what's possible with fingering on the instrument so that I've just, this is pretty standard stuff of doing anything physical where you do all the options that are available to just get your body in the right perspective to do whatever it is you're going to do, running your joints through the full range of motion, that kind of concept. And then I start working. Usually at that point, I'll work on something tonal but not rhythmic. So at this point in my life, I'll often pick, say, usually a little bit more exotic tonality. I don't really feel the need to work with some of the more standard tonalities because I've just spent so much massive amounts of time on them already. So I'll pick a tonality like, let's say, Maya Malavagala, which is a South Indian raga,
Okay,
and I'll
wait, hold on,
just
hold on,
work on.
hold on. So what is that? Okay, because I thought you were gonna be like, "Oh, I'm tired of playing the key of E," and then you start throwing some wild stuff out there. Let's backpedal a bit. What is that?
Yeah. So Maya Malavagala is a South Indian raga, and it's a really interesting raga. It's not a sound that we have so much in Western music, but we should because it's really cool. And what it is, I can sing it for you.
Please do.
Sa it's sa ri ga ma pa da ni sa ni da pa ma ga ri sa. So it's a root, minor ninth, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, minor sixth, major seventh, and then the root again. That's Maya Malavagala. And just a really interesting tonality. It's the tonality that's most used for practicing in South Indian music. In the North, actually, they use the major scale. That actually is the tonality they work on the most. But in the South, it's a big one they use. And so I work on something like that and try to do all the different patterns. I play all the triads in that tonality, play all the triads in every inversion in that tonality, and just try to really be good at it. But I'm also trying to, um, if I'm playing the fretless, I'm also working really hard on intonation. Uh, Intonation is actually a really, really complex thing. I mean, on one level, it's simple. You just try to play in tune, and if the tuner says it's in tune, then you're done. But on another level, it gets really, really complex, and this is something I work with a lot. So if I'm working on Maya Malavagala in the fretless, I'll also be working a whole lot on the intonation and trying to get exactly the right intonation for each tone in the context of that tonality. So yeah, that's where I'll start, and then as it's pretty boring, as you say, and pretty intense. I'm kind of applying every bit of intellectual and physical energy I have to the process. So as this goes on, I tend to loosen up and do more improvising and less exercise, and add rhythm in and try to do more rhythm work. So that's very typical kind of thing I do. Some days I'll just focus on rhythm for a while, and as the practice session goes on, I'll try to be more and more fun and kind of a little less, just really zoning in on one note for 30 seconds. And um, often there's music I need to work on. So that usually put that kind of later in the practice session as well. But that's most typically how things go for me. Hopefully that makes sense.
No, this is amazing. I love this. Okay, so I do have a follow-up question, which
Mm.
is, all right. I mean, okay, so I'm gonna play ignorant American here. All right. Where do you learn all this stuff about like Indian music, like for a Westerner? How I mean, like I've listened to, Ravi Shankar and Omar no, what's his name? The tabla guy, the really good. I forget his name. His name's blanking on me, but he's a great tabla player. Uh,
Zakir Hussain, probably.
Zakir Hussain, thank you. I've
Yeah.
seen him in concert, phenomenal, and that was really, it's like if I saw Earth, Wind, and Fire a couple years ago, and you know I've been playing music now for a couple decades, and I know how Earth, Wind, and Fire works. Do you know what I mean? Like I know what key
Yeah.
they're in. I know the tonalities. I know the tones.
Yeah.
I know,
Exactly.
and it's great. I love it. But I know how it works. When I saw Zakir Hussain, I was just like, "What? I don't know what is going on here. I'm so confused." Where does one learn about these scales? And is there resources for Westerners that are easy to find for this kind of stuff?
Yeah, it used to be quite difficult. As a kid, I was just interested in the sound and wanted to learn as much as I could, and would go to the library. Basically, was the place I went. And there were books about Indian music, but they were really unhelpful. And it's kind of not the way you learn about Indian music. I've still got some Indian music books that are interesting, but there's like, yeah, this is not really how you think about Indian music. Um, but things have changed so much. I mean, you can hear lectures by master musicians. Just go on YouTube and find amazing things and people explaining all this stuff. I've been lucky enough to play. I've played with Zakir actually, and as much as he would allow me, I pestered him with 1,000 questions about how this works and how that works, um, and super nice guys. Totally happy to sit there and show me on his tabla how his dad was a great tabla player too. His dad was Ravi Shankar's tabla player, and show me how this is the rhythm as he got it, and then he changed it this way, and then and so on. So this is my passion. I just really am interested in all this stuff, and want to be able to understand as much as possible and use it to try to make sense of life. That's what it is for me. I'm a pretty obnoxious person overall. Not only am I really boring, but I am always having an existential crisis, and have since I was like 9 years old. Um, but music is a way for me to process that. So whenever I learn something about music, it's like, oh, okay, so this is, music is it's not just doesn't just exist kind of randomly. It's always about life. It's always telling you something about life. So I'm trying to figure out, what is this element of musical idea tell me about life, and how can I make sense of that? But yeah, it's amazing. Now you can just go. YouTube is an amazing teacher. I mean, and there's just incredible stuff out there. You can learn all kinds of stuff. In some ways, maybe even better than having a teacher in some ways, because you can go to a lot of different teachers and see what they're doing. I wouldn't recommend that. The way to really to learn Indian music is you sit down with the teacher, and that's your guru. Um, but you don't have to do that, especially if you don't want to play Indian music. If you just want to learn about it, then there's just so much information out there now, and um, I wouldn't recommend doing that unless it's something that interests you. There's no particular reason to do it unless you're you're interested in it. Um, and there's a lot of things I'm not interested in that I don't know anything about. I know almost nothing about sports, for instance. So yeah, it's just having the passion, and just feeling incredibly lucky to live at this time when I can get a lot of my questions answered so that I can generate a whole bunch more.
So obviously there is YouTube, but is there a good place to start, especially like to learn like the scales and things like that? Do you have any places where you think people should start with that stuff?
If you wanted to learn about Indian music, um, there's a great podcast for about South Indian music where you can really learn a lot. They have, I think they went up to something like 70 episodes, kind of a lot, but they do kind of walk you through it. It's called Raga Rasika. Rasika means like a
How
workshop.
do you spell that?
It's all one word, and they spell it. Um, there's hundreds of different languages in the Indian subcontinent, and so there's a million different spellings of everything when you put it into English. But their spelling is Raaga, so that spelling of
Okay.
raga, and then the last half of the word is rasika, Rasika,
Okay.
and it's a great resource if you want to understand South Indian music. It may be more than you want. But if you want to get into it, you can just listen to the bunch of those podcasts, and they really kind of walk you through what it is. There are other ones as well, um, but it kind of depends on. A lot of this depends on how participatory you want it to be. Um, Most of the stuff that's out there is really quite participatory, which is great. So they'll walk you through the exercises you do to learn about Indian
Hey,
music.
we're
But
all for
it's
going in depth here at Rhinestone, man. Let's hear it.
yeah. Well, there's a lot of, just Indian music lessons like that online, and they're great, both North Indian and South Indian. But there's basically two forms of quote classical music in India. North Indian, which is called Hindustani, and South Indian, which is called Carnatic. They're both really interesting. There's a lot of overlap, but they're not the same. And yeah, those are great resources. There's probably somebody probably has a kind of an introductory lecture someplace that you can kind of just kind of get an introduction as opposed to kind of jumping in to the full business. But if you're a musician, I really recommend it. It's kind of interesting the way music has worked in history. I don't want to go. I want to bore you too much with all this
No,
stuff.
no, bore
Um,
us, go deep.
so one way of thinking about music is, well, let me start here. Music has been part of every culture we've ever found throughout history. So you dig up a old site and you find people used to live there. They had music. Everybody had music, and it's incredibly central to who we are. We kind of forget that. Possibly, it seems to me maybe even more central to who we are than language. We kind of think of language as what really makes us human. Maybe music even more. So it's really, really central. It's really powerful in our lives. When we think about what that means, music has always done a few different things, and there's a lot of overlap between these. But we could say there's always been folk music. People have always used music to make the kind of drudgery of life easier. So they've always had songs to sing while you're cooking or, you know, hunting or whatever it is, or just walking. Um, there are songs that you share with people to tell stories. Everybody everywhere has always done that. Everybody everywhere has also done spiritual music. Music has always been part of everybody's spiritual experience, whatever that is. It's kind of interesting, actually. We've never found any culture that didn't have music as part of their spiritual experience, whatever that is. There's this other way of thinking about music. Again, there's a lot of overlap between these that I usually refer to as aesthetic music. So what this means is when you have a group of people who are professional musicians, almost always associated with a court, so the royalty, princes, kings, where they'll get a group of musicians and they'll say, "Okay, I just want you to spend all your time on music, really study it, really master it, really, and then give me, the fruits of your labor. I just want you to totally go deep into music and and really make an art form out of it in that way." Hard to know what to call that music. We usually call that classical music, but that's not really the greatest term. So I use this term aesthetic music for that. And a lot of cultures have had this. Not everybody, because not everybody can afford to have that kind of situation. But that happened a lot in Asia. China, there was a lot of this kind of music. In Japan, there was a lot of this kind of music. In Java, in Indonesia. But the two kind of big ones were in Europe and in India. They were really kind of successful in this process of taking music and really trying to understand it, really trying to work with it. And there's these two kind of systems, and these are kind of the ones that have kind of the most useful in a way, I guess. I hate to say that because the Japanese version is really cool, the Chinese version is really cool. A lot of these aesthetic musics are really cool, but the European and the Indian are just really powerful. They found lots of interesting things. And so I kind of recommend anybody who's really serious about music kind of go into that Indian place a little bit and learn about what they did. Um, because it's a little different from how we did things in the West, but totally applicable. Totally, totally stuff we can use. Um, so right, does that make
No,
sense?
this is amazing. I love this. This is fascinating.
So right, so that's kind of where that is. So I- it's there's only kind of so much you can study folk music. Like if you want to learn the blues, it doesn't really make sense to go sit in a classroom so much. It really, you know, the way you learn the blues is somebody says, well, you play this, you play it this way, and you play it for them, and they say, no, that's not right. You play it like this. And then they say, that's it. You've played the blues. And that's kind of all there is to it. The same is true if you want to learn Wawanko or, a million other different kinds of music in the world. But with these aesthetic musics, it's a little bit more you can kind of sit in a classroom and learn how they work. And they tell us these things about music. Is that the whole story? Probably not. There's other stuff too. The interesting thing is there's also the scientific approach to music. So you can get a whole lot out of studying acoustics and psychoacoustics, music cognition, psychology of music. There are these avenues that are open to us too. Um, so right, I don't want to kind of overwhelm you with all this data, but yeah, that's all these different ideas to work with.
No, I love it. And it's a great reminder that as soon as you think you've hit a wall in music, there's so many other directions to go, and it's never ending, and you'll never learn all of it, you know.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
It's awesome.
Which is it's kind of odd actually because music. I mean, if we compare music to language, there's 26 letters in the English alphabet. In music, it's really 12, and we really don't use them all at the same time. So it's simpler in a way, um, but it ends up being really, really complex.
So let's go back to practicing a little bit. One of the things you brought up is your sense of rhythm and how you work on rhythm, which is one of the things I think that is really interesting, especially as a solo bass player. Your rhythm is incredibly engaging, and it I think it's really one of the things that separates you from a lot of other bass players is just how your rhythm is just so on point. What are things that musicians can do to improve their rhythm?
I mean, your questions are so great. I mean, I wish more people would ask that question because that's usually the one we're bad at. And it's certainly true for me. I mean, I've really struggled so much with rhythm.
That's wild to hear you say that, by the way.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's really tough. Uh, I have gotten better over the years, thank God, because I've really, I've really worked so hard on it. But it is a really tough one, and it's one that doesn't tend to get taught that much. You can go to music school and get a degree in music, and only have maybe a few classes in rhythm. Everything else is teaching you about harmony. And I have this terrible fear that that's because it's a lot easier to teach harmony than it is to teach rhythm. With harmony, there are recognizable structures, and you can talk about how they move and how you can analyze them and how they tendencies between them and then how you can extend them, things like that. With rhythm, it's a little harder to really get studious about it, which is a shame because you kind of most of us really have to do that. There's maybe a handful of people that just are born rhythmic, and that's it. But very few. For instance, Zakir Hussein, who you mentioned, might be the most advanced rhythmic human on the planet, as far as I can tell. Just works endlessly on it, just constantly on it. It's kind of amazing. You wonder after a while what else there could be left for him to do, but he is working on it. So it is something we need to work on. Um, there's a few things I could say about it. This is one of the reasons it's nice to study Indian music, is they have a method for studying rhythm, particularly in South Indian music and Carnatic music, and that's really quite effective and useful, um, and really kind of one of the few really effective rhythmic methods there are. In the West, we kind of we kind of were anti-rhythmic in kind of the classical era. They actually tried not to be rhythmic. It's kind of an interesting thing to do. We could talk about that if you like. So we have a little bit of a disadvantage of that in that way. Um, but yeah, it's a matter of studying the. I'll share what I guess is supposed to be a secret of some kind. I don't know why, but rhythm is really kind of mostly about two things. It's mostly about accuracy and phrasing. Um, so mostly what makes us like a rhythm is that it's accurate and it's phrased well. That's about an 80% rule. The rhythms we like that aren't accurate, but most of the ones we like are accurate. Now, accuracy is a complex concept because accurate to what is the question. And there's a lot of rhythms that may at first not sound accurate, but are actually accurate to a really interesting grid that they're locked to. But just an accurate rhythm isn't enough. It has to be phrased well. It has to tell a story of some kind. So if we just hear, like a electronic sound of just make a snare drum playing eighth notes, electronic sample playing eighth notes, is nothing's more obnoxious than that. But as soon as you add some phrasing to it, make some of the notes louder and quieter and different tones in there as well, then it gets a lot more interesting. So that's really kind of the thing with rhythm. That's what you're trying to do. So for most of us, it's mostly about playing accurately, and it's really hard to do because our cognitive abilities are really, really finely tuned rhythmically. There's a famous little test you can. I think that's even you can do it online if you like. That shows you how much more accurate your hearing is in terms of timing than your eyesight. We normally think of our eyesight being our most powerful sense, but in this way, our hearing is really much better. It's like something like 10 times better, where they're like flash two images, and you have to tell, when they're in sync, and then you hear two sounds. And with sounds, it's milliseconds apart that we can hear the difference. Something like 10 milliseconds, someplace in there we can hear the difference. And with seeing images, it's it's like 10 times more than that what we need. And yourself from you work with a delay line. Once you get to
Yep.
about 10 milliseconds, you still start to hear the difference in the sound. And that's really a tiny little bit of difference. To control your body to work within that tiny little millisecond uh, framework is very difficult to do. Really, really, really hard to do, and it matters. So if you just played a note 10 milliseconds too late, that's going to have an impact on the music you played. Now that may be the one thing you wanted to do. It may sound good, but most of the time it's not going to do that. So the bulk of working on rhythm is just trying to work on the accuracy. That's a bulk of it. Yeah, I mean, you always want to have time to use whatever ideas you're working with expressively. But it's that push and pull of working on the really boring stuff and then trying to use it in a creative way.
Yeah, it's wild how important rhythm is, and I agree with you 100%. Like I went to music school, and we didn't really talk about rhythm that much. It was just like these are eighth notes, these are 16th notes, these are triplets. Figure it out. and,
Yeah.
and here's
Yeah.
a swing rhythm for you jazz guys,
Right.
and so, yeah, it's a really good point. I never thought about that, so you just pointed that out. Like, we don't talk about rhythm at all.
And it's funny because it matters so much, because everybody can hear this. Then, we're not aware we hear it. This is the way music works, is we're all born insanely musical, but we're just not aware of how musical we are. And if you play something that's rhythmically really cool, so in general, really accurate and phrased really well, you can kind of put any notes on that and people will like it, as opposed to the other way around where you have, the notes are exactly what they're supposed to be, but the rhythm is, maybe not all there. Anybody will notice that. You don't have to have any musical training at all to know, that doesn't really sound quite right. It's funny how that is, but we tend to kind of gloss over the rhythmic part of it. And I would say that of the musicians I know, the rhythm is kind of the big secret. The guys that are great with rhythm are always working. Everybody wants to play with them. How much they know of the other stuff is, whatever it is. But, if your rhythm is really awesome, everybody wants to work with you.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the reasons I pick my musicians, the ones that are rhythmic,
Yeah.
right? There's the ones that work for sure.
It makes it a lot easier, doesn't it?
Definitely. All right. So last question about practicing. I'm gonna floor you again with this one here. Um, as far as your practicing is goes, what has been the biggest waste of time in your practicing, and what has been of the most benefit to you in practicing?
Oh, yeah. These are good questions. Um, so I mentioned earlier that I always spend time with this kind of body mechanics stuff. So thinking about, with my instrument, it's thinking about the left hand and the right hand, trying to be the most efficient, the most healthy, the most effective as I can be. So I've spent a lot of time doing just the simplest thing you can think of. So, like, maybe put on the metronome and try to play the E string on whole notes for every 4 beats, but try to do it with the most effective body mechanics, the best sound, try to keep the dynamic exactly right, that kind of thing. Whatever super simple thing you can think of. And I think I spent too much time on that. I think I spent too much time doing that kind of stuff and not enough time on tonal material. Because as I mentioned, the tonal material is really the trickiest stuff to master. And the most effective, the Indian rhythm stuff has been helpful for me just because, it is really hard to find ways to study rhythm. And this Indian system is good. The thing, it's usually called Konakal, and it's a system you can study. And then again, there's amazing resources online. You can see some of the guys that were the best at it in the world who will blow your mind with what they can do and what they can think rhythmically. You would just think, you know, nobody could conceive of this rhythm, and these guys can just, they can conceive it, not only conceive it, but perform it perfectly, as far as I can tell. But it's also good just for understanding how rhythm works and kind of getting rhythms in your body and um, getting that kind of thing to be second nature. But as to whether that's been the most helpful, kind of hard to say. One thing that's super helpful for me is recording. That's been really helpful. Um, there's uh, m- my thinking is this, that music is such a complex activity that we know this, that it's actually using your whole brain when you play music. It's the most brain intensive activity we're aware of. Actually, this has been measured pretty effectively. In fact, my understanding is that if you take dead people and look at their brains, you can actually tell if that was a musician. You can't tell if they were an athlete or a mathematician or anything else, but you can actually look at a person's brain and know if they were a musician. That's my understanding. It's a really, really powerful brain activity. So because of that, I'm pretty sure that we there's a lot of overlap in the parts of your brain you're using. So when you're playing music, you have to use some of your speech centers and I think even some of your visual centers when you're playing music, because you're kind of using the whole thing. And I think because of that, it's really hard to hear yourself really well when you're playing. And so recording is so valuable in that, because you can play something and then sit back and listen, and you hear it better when you play it back. And so that's been really powerful for me because it's always good to assume the tape doesn't lie, as we say. But yeah, I guess those things would have been the most helpful. There's a lot of other things as well, but those are good.